As Paul writes those words, the Apostle Paul writes those words to the church in Philippi, you've got to love the way that he both gently admonishes the Philippian church for their old behavior, even as he commends their more improved behavior now. That it's kind of like he says, y'all have now revived your concern for me. You weren't so concerned for me before, but that's okay. That's all right. Gently admonishing them, even as he encourages them in their improved behavior. They've revived their concern, but the fact that it's been revived means that there was a time when that concern, that support, ebbed low. And so now they've improved. And in recognition of that time of want for Paul, he insists that it's okay because he has learned how to be content in all circumstances. Now, I believe that he's being genuine in this. He's not really saying, oh, that's fine. I'll just go along here on my own without any help or concern from you. I think he legitimately means that it's okay that he has been without for a little while because he means it when he says he's learned how to be content in all circumstances. If we think about where Paul probably is and what he's been through in the years leading up to the current imprisonment that he's in at this time that he writes this letter, you know that he's been arrested and imprisoned at least once before. People have been seeking his life simply because of the fact that he's preaching the gospel message. He gets thrown into prison not because he's committed crimes in the way that we would understand them, except to say that being faithful to what God was calling him to do was illegal for him in that time. So he's doing exactly what he's supposed to do, and he's getting in trouble for it. People have sought his life because of the preaching of the gospel, and that reality was what caused me to select the hymn "A Mighty Fortress," because that was a hymn that was written by the great reformer of the Middle Ages, Martin Luther, who at the time that he wrote that hymn, and I guess you kind of need to understand a little bit what led up to that, was that Martin Luther was a faithful Catholic priest, and he had some concerns about the way that church did certain things and what the church believed, and so he had put up for debate these certain points, 95 points, but he was not one for brevity, I guess, but he put up these 95 points that he just wanted to have a discussion in the life of the church. And because of that, he wasn't just excommunicated from the church, but they put on him what's called the ban. And what that means is that if they found him, if they caught up to him, they would take his life. He would be executed for what he had been doing. And so he writes this hymn in hiding. And he writes these words, "A mighty fortress is our God," as he knows his life is in danger. So like Martin Luther, the Apostle Paul before him has been doing exactly what God has called him to do, and people are after him because of it. He's been on missionary journeys. He's been shipwrecked and encountered all manner of hardships, but along the way, he's also seen visions fulfilled. God's promises come to reality. He's seen miracles happen. He's seen people healed. He's seen the dead raised to life. He's helped plant churches and seen them strengthened and flourishing, some of which are thriving even in the most hostile of cultures. He's had some experience dealing with life's difficult times, journeying through some difficult spots as he does God's work. So even though the possibility of a death sentence looms over him in his current imprisonment, as is evident from the rest of the letter, Paul is confident that it is God who is at work, that he has been led to this place because of God's activity in his life, and that God is still providing, and therefore his tone remains positive and upbeat. But when we first start our journey with God, we're not always so confident that things are going to work out so well. And that is true for any number of characters in the Bible. Not the least of whom is, and this is a story that is one of my favorite call stories, in fact, it may be my favorite call story, is the calling of Moses. And normally when I read this call story, I'll go through about verse 14, but I'm going to stop at 12 because verse 12 catches my attention, and that's really the core verse that I want us to look at for this morning. But I invite you now to join me in our Old Testament reading, Exodus chapter 3, verses 1 through 12, excuse me. Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law, Jethro, the priest of Midian. He led his flock beyond the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And there, the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of a bush. And he looked, and the bush was blazing, yet it was not consumed. Then Moses said, I must turn aside and look at this great sight and see why it is the bush is not burned up. And when the Lord saw that he had turned aside to see, God called him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. Then he said, Come no closer, remove the sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. He said further, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Then the Lord said, I have observed the misery of my people who are in Egypt. I have heard their cry on account of their taskmasters. Indeed, I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them from the Egyptians and bring them up out of that land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the country of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. Let me stop for a moment and say, Pastor Calvin is really glad I didn't give this reading to him this morning. But we continue. The cry of the Israelites has now come to me, and I have also seen how the Egyptians oppress them. So come, I will send you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? And he said, I will be with you, and this shall be the sign for you that it is I who sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall worship God on this mountain. I don't know about you, but if I'm about to face some sort of trial that God is telling me I'm going to go through, and that's exactly what Moses is dealing with here, and he asks the question, how am I going to know that this is really what you're calling me to do? And God responds to him and says, I'll give you a sign afterward. This will be a sign to you. You'll come and worship God on this mountain after you've led the people out of Egypt. If I were going to ask for a sign, I'd ask for it up front. Lord, if this is what you want me to do, then first show me this sign. But of course, what Moses fails to realize is maybe he's already being given a sign on the front end, because after all, he's hearing words from a bush that's on fire and not being consumed. Okay, so maybe, just maybe, Moses is failing to realize the sign that is right in front of him out there in the wilderness. Maybe the real reason he's going to need to see a sign later is because when he gets to that mountain of Horeb again with God's people, he's worried about going to Pharaoh. And God's going to give Pharaoh his own signs. But Moses thinks that the journey will be done, but he's only just getting started when he gets to Horeb the next time. Maybe he's going to have to look back at that point and be encouraged and say, yeah, it really is God who's bringing me through all of this, even in light of all the trouble along the way. Not too long ago, a couple of years ago, Jana and I began a journey that was fraught with all kinds of uncertainty. As we took a little trip with what turned out to be a minor form of cancer. Now, I think I need to explain why I'm putting air quotes around minor, because cancer, whether it's minor or not, is still cancer, right? We had moved to Corpus Christi, and Jana had gotten a new doctor, as we do when we move to new places. You get new doctors and dentists and all those sorts of things. And as the doctor was going through Jana's medical history, she recognized there were some thyroid issues on there, and Jana was on medication for her thyroid. And she said, this new doctor said, when was the last time you had an ultrasound done? She said, ultrasound? Didn't even know you're supposed to do that. And she said, yeah, you need to be on ultrasounds on a regular basis to take a look at your thyroid in case there's some sort of trouble developing there. And so she, of course, ordered an ultrasound, and they looked at the results of the ultrasound, and they saw there were a couple of little nodules on her thyroid, which might be something, it might be nothing, right? We've been through that road before. There have been other times when Jana and I have looked at test results that the doctor's given us, and they say, well, we need to run further tests to see if it's anything to be concerned about. And thankfully, all the other times in the past, it ended up being nothing. Just a cyst or something like that. Anyway, so we continued along the route of tests, and actually, one of the tests that was required for the biopsy that needed to be done was actually removing a half of her thyroid. So that's actually pretty traumatic surgery, but it would have been so much more traumatic to remove the entire thing, and the doctor didn't seem all that concerned about it. So she had the surgery, they ran some frozen sections, and within just, a couple of days of having that surgery, we found out that a week to the day of the first surgery, she was going to have surgery again. So 2 major surgeries in the course of a week. It's pretty traumatic. But we heard them say the results that, yes, this was cancer. And when you hear that C word, it does something in your soul, whether it's a diagnosis for you or someone close to you, even if it is a minor form of cancer. And of course, we did like probably everybody else in this room does when they receive a diagnosis of any kind. We went to Dr. Google for further consultation. And I came to learn that if there's a hierarchy of deadliness to cancers where, like, say, having a little skin thing removed off of your face or your ear or something like that is down here in terms of severity, and the more serious ones like pancreatic cancer and brain cancer are up here, we think probably based on what we read, thank you, Dr. Google, that the particular form of thyroid cancer that she had was right in there, close to the bottom. If you're going to have a form of cancer, and I pray that you don't have to have a form of cancer, but if you're going to have one, thyroid, this particular variety of thyroid cancer is not particularly deadly, but it does have to be addressed. And removing a thyroid is no easy procedure, and the recovery is kind of tough. Well, in addition to that, many cancers are followed up with either radiation therapy or chemotherapy, and this one was kind of, in my estimation, I don't think a doctor would say this, but I'm not a doctor, so I can. This particular form of treatment was sort of a one-dose combination of the two, because it was a pill that Jana was to take of iodine, but it was radioactive iodine. And the reason they do that is because iodine sticks to thyroid tissue. And so if you take radioactive iodine, it does this little seek and destroy number on all the remaining thyroid tissue in your body, because one other thing that we began to discover is thyroid tissue can migrate throughout your body. It doesn't always stay right here. So here's the thing about that treatment. Since it's radioactive, a couple of things happened. She had to go for an overnight hospital stay isolated, including from me. And I don't know about you, but when a loved one is in the hospital, if it's my wife or my kids, I want to be there too. Or if it's, it's one of the kids that Jana wants to be there, one of us needs to be there. And so here I had to just kind of let her go off to the hospital and come back. Radioactive too, was the way she came back. They even sent her out with this little letter. And this little letter is kind of like for if any of y'all have, metal in your body somewhere and there's a letter you have to carry with you to the airport. Well, this was a letter that you have to carry around with you wherever you go, because you and I don't know where Homeland Security has set up radiation detectors. And if we happen to get the attention of some sort of authorities, we got to have that letter to prove why it is that she's setting off their Geiger counters. But that time passed, and we moved through that, and the radiation subsided, and life sort of continued. But funny thing about that is, even if it's a minor form of cancer, it's still cancer. And she's going to be on medicine for the rest of her life. We kind of thought she was going to have to be on medicine for the rest of her life anyway, but now she doesn't have a thyroid. And so if she were ever to stop taking that medication, she would slowly but surely die. So we've had to adjust a little. Our lives have changed, and although we have adjusted, our lives have changed forever. So here's what I want to say about those times when our lives get interrupted, because let me tell you, brothers and sisters, our lives were absolutely interrupted. God speaks when our lives are interrupted. That's my first point if you're following along on the worship outline in the bulletin. God speaks when our lives are interrupted. Now, as I say that, I realize there's two things that I have to quickly point out that I'm not saying. Number one, I'm not saying that God always or never causes the interruptions. You know, I'm kind of a funny animal because I'm a Methodist who went to a Presbyterian seminary, and if you know things about Methodist and Presbyterian theology, you know that we have this wonderful debate going about the sovereignty of God versus human free agency. And, you know, Presbyterians err on the side of predestination, that all of life has kind of been written out to some degree or another. And then we Methodists tend to follow more of a free will sort of way of thinking. But since I'm a Methodist who went to a Presbyterian seminary, I think somehow both of those things are true. I haven't figured out how, but somehow both of those things are true. God is both 100% completely and utterly sovereign, and two, we have an option as to how we respond to God and the decisions that we make. So, that being said, I think it's important for me to say that I'm not saying that God always causes these interruptions where he happens to speak, but I'm also not saying he never causes them. And here's the other thing that I need to point out is that those interruptions are not the only time that God speaks. In fact, if we have a life that is marked by routines of faithfully pursuing God through the disciplines of the faith, things like prayer and attending worship and being involved in small groups and so forth, we expect God to be speaking to us in big ways and small ways on a regular basis. But when our lives do get interrupted, when our routines get so radically derailed by something like a diagnosis, we need to stop and pay attention to what God is saying. God said some pretty powerful things to me during that time. And here's what Jesus says about the way he comes to us. If you read in the book of Revelation, toward the beginning, in chapter 3, verse 20, he's saying to the early church, and he's saying to us, "Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come in to eat with him and he with me." Now, what he's not saying there is, at a mutually agreed upon time, we'll have a meeting. Or I'm going to send you a note, and if you would like me to come by, please let me know. Or I'm going to call you, and you call me back sometime when you're ready for us to sit down and have a chat. No, he says, I'm standing at the door knocking. I'm not going to break down the door, but I'm knocking. If you open the door, we can spend some time together. Jesus says, "Behold, I stand at the door and knock." I don't know about you, but whenever my doorbell rings or my door gets knocked on, it's never convenient. I'd much rather stay in my recliner right where I was, watching the back of my eyelids, or maybe I was working on something important where I can't be interrupted. Never seems to be convenient. Well, Jesus doesn't wait for it to be convenient for us before he starts getting our attention. I learned a lot about myself and about the depth of my love for my wife through that interruption of cancer. Now again, hear me. I am not saying necessarily that God did or did not cause her to come down with cancer. That's something I think I'll probably figure out later, probably much later, like after I've reached the other side. But there were some things that happened in my life right there that kind of told me some things about my own character and reminded me how important this relationship is. Here's the second thing I want to say if you're following along in the worship outline. Things will never be the same again. Whether we're talking about those interruptions and those places where our routines and our lives get derailed, but really the truth of the matter is whatever is going on in our lives and in the world, things will never be the same again. For our experience of cancer, thyroid medication is a permanent necessity now. For those of you that have experienced other forms of cancer, there is the lingering possibility that that cancer might return, or that it might show up in another form, in another organ or system in your body. You know, there's a saying in recovery circles, whether it's recovery from a disease, an addiction, or a loss in your life, you might as well just give up trying to get back to normal again. Instead, you need to begin to find the new normal. Meaning that things aren't always going to continue as a crisis, but there's some things you just don't ever get over, so to speak. They become a part of who you are, and something you have to continue to deal with. In a time when the prophet Isaiah was telling of the consequences that God was visiting upon Israel for their disobedience, he then tells of a time when their punishment would be over. And God tells them through the prophet that things would never be the same again. And here's how he says it to them. In Isaiah chapter 43, verses 18 and 19, he says, "Do not remember the former things or consider the things of old. I am about to do a new thing. Now it springs forth. Do you not perceive it? I will make a way in the wilderness and rivers in the desert." In other words, there's a wilderness there. But some water is going to come up, and the wilderness is going to be transformed. It's still going to be the same wilderness, but it's not going to be a desert anymore. You don't get to go back to Egypt, but things are changing, and they're getting better. The truth is that even if it's not a traumatic experience, events and experiences always change us and change the world around us. I'm not going to say that change in and of itself is a good thing or a bad thing. Change just is. It happens. Inevitably. We can work for good change. We can, in light of change, what we do with it can become a good thing, and we can learn to adapt and respond to bad changes in good and helpful and healthy ways. But the fact of the matter is, change is just something we have to deal with. Things are always changing around us. I'm reminded again of those visits to my town, the home of my childhood, and the story I shared with you about how I didn't go up the road because that wasn't my house anymore, and there was a sign there saying, "Keep out," actually 2 signs. But as I looked around those communities, I realized they were different. Things had changed. Things had gotten bigger, certain trees were much larger than I remembered, and other things seemed smaller because I'd gotten bigger. And some people who used to be there were gone now. I was not a resident of that community anymore. And not only that, but the feel of the community had become more of a resort area, and that changes the character of a community. Maybe it was sort of there when I had lived there before. I just didn't realize it because I was a little kid, but things were different. That place had changed and I had changed, and it proved true, that saying that you can never go home again. Third and finally this morning, some things in our lives are only going to make sense later. Some things will only make sense later. I don't know all the reasons why God allows certain things to happen to us, like why Jana got cancer, or if you rewind back further in my life, why my dad left when he did, or why it is that loved ones are too often taken away from us unexpectedly and tragically early in our lives. But often I am privileged to witness in my own life and in the lives of those around me how God works a plan in the midst of these things, whether they're things he caused or things he's redeeming. I mean, after all, God redeems even some of our most terrible choices. While I still may be making sense of why it was that my wife came down with cancer, there's some other things that in retrospect seem now to be a way that God was taking care of us. For instance, before we moved to where we were living at that time, when we were getting ready to move to Corpus Christi, Jana was working on a teaching certification and working hard on it, and really had discerned what seemed like a calling in her life, that she was being called into teaching. She'd always been someone who worked, for state, county, and local government agencies and so forth, and now she was discerning this calling into teaching. And so, she had supported me so earnestly in my calling. I felt like it was, okay, I better support her in this as well. And as we prayed about it, we realized, yes, is the direction God's leading us. And then we get moved. And Jana can't find a teaching job to save her life. At least not in the way that we expected it. So in the meantime, she began to substitute teach, and she was able to do it on a pretty regular basis. And even though that's not the same thing as being a regular teacher, it allowed us to supplement our income. And let me tell you something, when the time came for us to need flexibility in her work schedule because of this illness, we were so glad that she wasn't having to call in sick for extended periods of time. And that she had the flexibility that when the phone rang and they said, hey, we need you for a sub job, she could say, hey, you know what, keep me on the list, but not yet. I'm still healing. And then the funny thing happened when we got through that. She no longer felt called to teaching anymore. And I don't think that's because she wasn't called to it. I think it's because God had adjusted the calling again. He had taken care of us, and she didn't have to lose a job in the midst of this battle with cancer. So God continues to work on us and to make adjustments, and sometimes things that seem like difficulties, like not being able to find the job we want, can actually be God's ways of providing for us. James says in chapter 1, verses 2 through 4 of his book, he says to the early church, and God says to us, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of any kind, consider it nothing but joy, because you know that the testing of your faith produces endurance, and let endurance have its full effect, so that you may be mature and complete, lacking in nothing. When Moses was journeying with the Hebrew people across the wilderness on a 40-year journey that for its distance should have taken a matter of a few weeks, the people got a little fed up with Moses and fed up with the journey. Sometimes even with the miracles that God was providing, they actually got tired of manna from heaven. They grumbled against Moses and formed the Back to Egypt Committee, although they didn't call it that. That's just something I heard another pastor say many years ago, and it stuck with me. And those committees, they tend to stick with certain churches for a long time. But Moses then even grumbled against them. So it's not just something the followers are guilty of from time to time, but leadership gets caught up in this. And for Moses, it cost him the promised land. He didn't get to go there, and God told him that this was why, because he grumbled against the people. But once the journey was complete, Moses went to have his funeral conducted by God himself. And the people finally entered the land, and they could look back on the journey and celebrate it, even in spite of their grumbling and what God had brought them through. You remember when God is addressing Moses from the burning bush, he says, this is the God who I am, I'm the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He names people in the story of who God is and who his people are. But after the journey through the wilderness, there's a few lines get added to that when God says who he is. He now also says, I'm the God who brought you out of Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. And so in our own stories, God is also saying, I'm the God who brought you through that cancer diagnosis. I'm the God who brought you through the loss of your loved one. I'm the God who brought you through your time in the wilderness with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. I'm sure that Paul, who diligently sought God even before his conversion to Jesus, if you know the story of Paul, you know that he was educated under one of the foremost rabbis of his day and was a Pharisee and studied God's word diligently. Even before that, I'm sure there were times when Paul, who was also called Saul of Tarsus, doubted God. I can only imagine what it must have been like for him when God struck him blind on his journey to Damascus. But after some experience of God bringing him through those situations, God enabled him to look at imprisonments and even the possibility that he would be executed for his faith with a positive outlook and trust that God was still in control, God was still providing, even if he had to face death, because the ultimate promised land was on the other side. There are trials that each of us have had to go through in our lives if we've lived long enough. Maybe right now you're in the midst of one of those trials and it doesn't yet make sense. But there are likely some issues, some situations, some stories of your life that, given enough perspective, enough time, and enough grounding in God's Word, paired with a vital prayer life, eventually begin to make more sense. You can see how God has woven them into the tapestry of your life when you look back at it from the perspective of time. We can look back at those things and see more clearly that even though we may have had trouble seeing it at the time, that God was walking with us through the trouble and that He was providing the whole way. It's kind of like that poem about the footprints, where the man sees the dream and he sees one set of footprints through the difficult times of his life. And at first he thinks, God, why did you abandon me and lead me to walk alone? And he says, no, I didn't abandon you. I picked you up and carried you. Here's the main point for this morning. Journeys through the wilderness are hard. There's no getting around that. Journeys through the wilderness are hard, but the promised land is on the other side, and God's going to go with you on the journey. If you're paying attention, you will see the signs all around you. But I also want you to take this question for consideration home with you, and this is important. This is, even if you didn't write the main point down, I want you to write down something else. The answer to this question: what is something in your life that only made sense later? And here's why I want you to write that down. What is something in your life that only made sense later? Because I believe that it's as we recall those events, like God saying, I'm the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and I'm the God who led you out of Egypt through the wilderness to the promised land. The people needed to remember that story, and we need to remember our story for those times when we get into the middle of something that doesn't make sense. Persevere. Stick with it. Don't give up. Keep calling out to God even when it seems like He's not answering you. There might be something that occurs to you later to you that He was speaking to you quite loudly all along the way. Hang on to the answer to that question. Write that down for your benefit. And not only for your benefit, but for those with whom you share your testimony of what God has done in your life.